I am Spantopia Rose, but you can call me Span. How are you? How are you? Tonight, right now, today, I'm here to read to you some bedtime stories. Now these are fairy tales for young children by Shirley Barber, and sadly, this is the last Shirley Barber storybook that I have in my collection. So it's the last of the Shirley Barber books I can read to you because it's the last one I have. I do have this, which is a puzzle book, which will get its own video eventually, but as for the reading of the stories, this is it, last one. I hope that you sit back and enjoy, and I will read a few of the little stories, if not all of them, to you now. Bedtime stories, fairy tales for young children. Lost in the forest. Now, children, said Mrs. Rabbit one sunny afternoon, I want you to go to Granny's burrow and give her a bottle of my violet cough syrup. When you arrive at the crossroads, take the path marked Primrose Lane. That will lead you to Granny's home. But if you see those two rattling brothers, don't stop to play with them, because you know they're always getting into mischief. Off went the two rabbits, Bobtail and Fluffkin. But when they reached the crossroads, who should they see but the two naughty young rats leaning against the signpost. Want to play marbles? Drawled Tip, rattling, but Bobtail shook his head. He hurried his sister Fluffkin along the path marked Primrose Lane, and away from the rattlings who jeered and whistled rudely after them. Bobtail and Fluffkin soon reached Granny's burrow, and she welcomed them with kisses and afternoon tea. Granny was glad to have the cough syrup because she had a tickling cough on cold nights. When it was time for them to return home, Granny told them how to find their way. Now when you reach the crossroads, take the path marked Cowslip Warren, she said, and then you will soon be safely home. The sun was setting in the sky when Bobtail and Fluffkin arrived at the crossroads, and Bobtail was glad to see the two rats had gone. This sign says Cowslip Warren, he told his sister, so that is our way home. As they went along the path, Fluffkin picked a bunch of lovely bluebell flowers she saw growing in the hedges, but Bobtail was becoming worried. The path where they were following seemed to be leading them deeper into the forest instead of home. Soon the sun set and the shadows gathered amongst the trees, and then, suddenly ahead of them, a fox barked. Bobtail stopped. Fluffkin, this must be the wrong path, he said. I think we're lost. We must find a hole to spend the night, and tomorrow, when it's light, we'll try to find our way home. But Bobtail couldn't find a hole deep enough to hide in, and he could hear the fox's bark becoming closer. Fluffkin was so frightened that she trembled, and her bunch of bluebells began to tinkle like bells. Did you call for me, little bunnies? Spoke a softly musical voice, and such a beautiful blue fairy appeared before them, holding a sparkling wand in her hand. Don't be afraid, she said. I've come to your rescue. I will use my magic to send the fox away on a long hunt over the hills, and I will teach those naughty rat brothers a lesson. They turned the signposts round so you would take the wrong path. That's why you became lost. Oh, thank you, kind fairy, chorused the little rabbits. Off they ran, their fears forgotten, along the path towards home. The fairy's comforting bluebell lamps lit up just ahead of them all the way, until they could see the lights of Cowslip Warren. When they ran into the arms of their mother and father, who were waiting for them at their own front door, after such an adventure in the dark forest, they were safely home once more. The Royal Jewelers. She's so beautiful. Under the hedge, by a big green field, stood a tiny shop with a notice over the door which said, Edwin Beetle and Son Jewelers. If you knelt down and peered through the window, you could see Mr. Beetle and his son Benny working in the shop, and Mrs. Beetle with her tiny pots and pans cooking a meal, while weeny baby Beetle slept in his nutshell cradle. The Beetles had a busy trade amongst the hedgerow folk, and they lived very comfortably until one day a red tractor as big to them as a mountain started to plough up the green field beside their shop. The Beetles, terrified, packed up the few things they could carry and fled till they reached the forests. Let's try again, shall we? The Beetles, terrified, packed up the few things they could carry and fled till they reached the forests of Fairyland. Here we stay, said Mrs. Beetle firmly. If we aren't safe living in Fairyland, well, I don't know where we can go, indeed I don't. So among the twisted roots of a large tree they did their best to start all over again and set up their tiny new shop with their new home behind it. At first, very few customers stopped to look at the necklaces and rings. Mr. Beetle laid them out upon toadstool tables, and one or two butterflies brought brooches. Several mice wanted earrings, and a millipede bought a number of the cheaper bracelets and ankle chains. But Mr. Beetle would sadly shake his head, remembering the nice shop and home he had once had. Nothing would ever be the same again, he thought. Then, one day, a beautiful golden fairy stopped and looked at the shop in surprise. She knelt down so she could see better, and Mr. Beetle and Benny proudly showed her the finest jewellery. These are wonderfully made, said the golden fairy. Your work is so fine. May I take the 3 necklaces to show the fairy queen? Mr. Beetle made haste to wrap the necklaces in flower petals, tying them into neat parcels with grass blades, and gave them to the fairy, but Benny worried. What if she doesn't bring them back, he asked, after she had flown away. She will, said Mrs. Beetle. Fairies are good, kind, and honest, not like some of those caterpillars we know. She will be back soon. Mrs. Beetle was right, and the next day the golden fairy reappeared. Mr. Beetle, the Queen loves your necklaces, and she wants to buy all 3, she said, smiling. She offers you 3 wishes in payment, and she would also like to order a very special tiara with a matching necklace and bracelet to be made in gold and many-coloured precious gems. Mr. Beetle was at first delighted, but then he became anxious. Where could he get all of the gold and different coloured jewels he would need for such an order? Dearie me, chuckled Mrs. Beetle, you've got 3 wishes, haven't you? Wish first for a golden jewel mine deep beneath this tree, second for a lovely new shop that's big enough to live in too, and third for a food cupboard that fills up again after you've taken things out. So that is what he did. Now a quaint little shop stands among the twisted tree roots, with bay windows and a display table outside to attract passing mice. Inside, Mr. Beetle is always busy at his workbench, while Mrs. Beetle looks after Baby Beetle, and cooks such delicious treats that there is nearly always a visitor dropping in for a chat and a slice of freshly baked cake. And every time Mr. Beetle needs another diamond or an emerald or a gold nugget, Benny nips down the tunnel to the mine below. So, now whenever anyone is sad about their life, Mrs. Beetle simply smiles and says, "Never give up hope. Look at us. We lost everything, and then overnight things changed here, and we were better off than we ever were before." The Unicorns. Among the golden hills of Fairyland, the unicorns run wild and free among the buttercups, with the sunlight flashing from their golden hooves and horns. One midsummer's day the sun was shining and a warm breeze was blowing, but there was a restless, unsettled air about the unicorns. "Mother," said a young foal whose name was Ivory, "everything seems strange today. Something is unusual about to happen. Is something unusual about to happen?" "Yes, dear," replied Moonbeam, his mother. "You are too young to remember, but every midsummer's day the fairy people come out in a procession up our hill country. With a golden flute they call all the unicorns to them, and the fairy children choose one of them to live with them for a year." "Does the unicorn ever come back again?" asked Ivory. "Oh yes," his mother replied. "When the fairies choose a new unicorn, they return the one who was chosen." Who was chosen the year before. 7 years ago I was chosen. I spent the year at the fairy palace learning how to be gentle with the fairy children and giving them rides. I was taught not to kick and to be obedient and never to nip fingers when taking foods from tiny hands. Ivory thought about all this for a few minutes while Moonbeam quietly cropped the sweet sun-warmed grass. "If they choose me," said Ivory, "I shall say, 'No, I don't want to go. I want to stay with you, Mother, always.'" Moonbeam lifted her head, lovingly nuzzled her young foal. "Dear one, if you are called by the golden flute, you can't help but go. It plays a magical note that unicorns cannot resist." Ivory tossed his head and went for a canter around the hills, scattering butterflies and flower petals as he went, his white mane and tail streaming in the fresh breeze. He was half a hillside away when a distant sweet fluttering brought him to a surprised halt. He found he could not help but turn towards it, and soon, quite against his will, he was cantering back to where all the other unicorns were gathering near the gate to their hillside. When he reached the gate, he saw the fairy folk and the flute player for the first time. They were laughing and singing as they made their way along the lane which led up from the lower regions of fairyland towards the gate where the unicorn stood. Ivory stepped to his mother's side and tried to hide, but the fairy children saw him and called joyfully, "That one! Oh, let's choose that one!" Ivory was frightened. "Not me, Mother," he pleaded. "Don't let them take me. I don't want to go. It isn't fair." Moonbeam gave him a velvet kiss. "Little son, it is an honor to be chosen by the fairies, and you must go. Don't be afraid. We'll soon be together again." Then the fairies placed a garland of flowers around Ivory's neck, and he went with them to fairyland. A year passed, and once again it was Midsummer's Day. Moonbeam gathered with the rest of the unicorns and stood patiently as the fairies chose a new unicorn to take with them to fairyland. Suddenly, Ivory was released by the fairy children and trotted briskly up to her. They nuzzled lovingly, and Moonbeam said, "You've grown, little son." And was it so bad after all? Ivory looked rather embarrassed. "I missed you, Mother, but I had a really good time, and I've learned how to be a gentle, well-behaved unicorn. They were all very kind to me and said I was the nicest pet unicorn they'd ever have." He tossed his head. "In fact, I don't know why I made such a fuss about going at all." Then he kicked up his golden heels and galloped away over the hills, scattering butterflies and flower petals and enjoying his freedom once again. That's seems a bit harsh, don't you think? A little bit harsh. Oh, this is a nice picture. It's a very nice picture. Okay. Wilfred's new friend. There were 2 mouse families in Filbert Wood, the Morleys and the Montgomerys. The young mice of both families went to school at Hollow Log Primary down near the wild raspberry patch, but the Montgomery mice were rich and their children had a scarf and umbrella for days when it was cold and rainy. The Morley mice, however, had no scarves at all, and only one umbrella between them. So if it began to rain when Wilfred Morley Mouse was on his way home from school, he just had to shelter in a hollow until it stopped or his mother came with the umbrella. One day it began to rain as Wilfred was running through the raspberry canes, so he ran to a hollow at the foot of the nearby tree and sat down to wait. Presently Millie Montgomery Mouse and her brother Milford came past under their umbrellas. "Who got his whiskers wet because he hasn't got an umbrella?" jeered Millie. So mean little mice. "Wet whiskers will dry soon enough," said Wilfred calmly. "Who only has an old bag to put his homework in instead of a proper school bag?" sneered Milford. "I may not have a smart school bag," replied Wilfred, "but at least I do my own homework." Everyone knew Mr. Montgomery Mouse did Milford's sums for him, so the brother and sister decided to hurry home before Wilfred could embarrass them further. Wilfred was making himself comfortable on some fallen leaves and practicing his tables up to 8 times 11, when suddenly a beautiful fairy dressed in shades of gold ran through the raindrops and arrived at the tree. "May I share your hollow and shelter here until this rain stops?" she asked breathlessly. Wilfred moved up to make room as the fairy settled herself and put down a basket of raspberries she had gathered. "I'm going to make some jam when I get home," she explained, "but we could eat 1 raspberry each now to help pass the time." Wilfred was rather shy at first, having never actually spoken to a fairy before, but by the time they had eaten a raspberry each and joked about the pips, they were feeling like old friends. The fairy told Wilfred how hard it was to rely on a magic wand when there were thunder and lightning about, and Wilfred told the fairy about sums and tables, and was surprised to find that fairies know nothing about such things at all. When they played I Spy with My Little Eye, and later Wilfred showed the fairy how to play noughts and crosses, using the back page of his schoolbook. As they played, the rain slowed, and soon the round, comfortable shape of Mrs. Morley Mouse appeared before them, under her big, patched umbrella. "There now, Wilfie," she chuckled, "perhaps I needn't have come meet you after all. The rain has almost stopped." Wilfred introduced his new friend to his mother, and they talked for a little while until the rain had stopped completely and the sun was shining brightly again. Then the fairy said a smiling goodbye to the mice, and promised to call by in a few days with a pot of her raspberry jam. "Well, you are a lucky mouse," said Wilfred's mother, watching the fairy flit away like a big golden butterfly. "There's not many who get the chance to make friends with a real fairy." "Yes," agreed Wilfred happily. "And do you know what, Mum? If we were rich and I had an umbrella on my own, I never would have met her at all." The Fairy Queen's Ruby Pendant. Elisa was Queen Elvira's younger sister. She was beautiful, golden-haired, impulsive, kind-hearted fairy, much loved by the pixies and fairy children because she was never too tired to run around and play games with them. The Queen, however, would say, "Elisa, you must quieten down, for you are a fairy princess, so behave with dignity." Elisa would try to be good for a while, but before she knew it, she would be running up the palace staircase again, hiding among the gilded columns while the fairy children chased her with squeals and shouts of laughter. Because of her high spirits, Elisa was often in trouble, and one day something really dreadful happened. The Queen was standing before her mirror holding up her ruby pendant to see if it went with her new ball gown. The ruby was a rare gem with a star glowing in its heart, given to her by the king to wear to the fairy ball in a few days' time. Suddenly, Elisa burst into the room, trying to hide from her little friends. She bumped into the Queen and knocked the pendant from her fingers. It fell to the marble floor and broke in 2 pieces. "Elisa," cried the Queen, "how could you be so clumsy? The ruby is ruined." So now Elisa was in trouble. The Queen was very upset, and the King frowned at Elisa when he met her in the palace hall. Only the palace children were still her friends. Elisa crept around like a mouse, wept in quiet places, and knew she would not be allowed to go to the ball. The day of the ball dawned, and the fairy children came running to find their favourite playmate. "Come down to the seashore with us, Elisa," they cried. "The tide is very low today. We can see jewels lying at the bottom of the rock pools, just waiting for us to pick them up." "I'm sorry," sighed Elisa. "I really haven't the heart for it. I feel too low and sad." "Do come, Elisa, coaxed the little pixie. "You know we aren't allowed to go on our own, and everyone else is too busy getting ready for the ball." The fairy princess was too kind-hearted to refuse the children, so together they set off for the seashore. A few fairy folk were already there, hoping to find a special jewel to wear with their new gown. In spite of her sadness, Elisa joined the search for gems. It was just as well, because before long she spotted a magnificent gem. "Oh, look, look," she cried, and snatched it from the water. It was a ruby with a double star in its heart, the rarest of all gems to be found in fairyland. Elisa and the children hurried back to the palace and asked to see the king. Your Majesty, said Elisa respectfully, I have found this beautiful gem and hope you will take it to give to my sister in place for the pendant that I broke. The king gasped at the beauty of the stone, and all the fairy children whispered and skipped with excitement. This is the finest jewel I have ever seen, he said. Thank you, Elisa. This certainly makes amends for your clumsiness. He called for the court jeweller, and soon a new glittering double-starred pendant was ready to be presented to the queen. Elisa stood shyly aside and watched as the king fastened the pendant around Queen Elvira's neck, while he explained where the beautiful jewel had come from. "Oh, Elisa," cried the queen, "it is the most beautiful ruby. All is forgiven and forgotten. And of course, you must come to the ball tonight." "Hooray!" shouted Elisa, almost beside herself with joy. She rushed out of the room, pursued by the crowd of fairy children. And the sound of her feet flying up the palace stairway could plainly be heard. The king and queen looked at each other in a resigned way. Elisa hadn't changed, but perhaps they didn't really want her to. Elfrin and the Baby Bluebird. It was the day before the Fairyland Flower Festival, and all the fairy folk were out in the fields and woodlands picking flowers to make wreaths and garlands. Netta took her baby brother, Elfrin, with her into the blossom woods to pick sprays for a floral arch. There were many other young fairies and elves picking pink and white blossoms, but Elfrin was the only baby there. He could walk and talk quite well, but he was not very good at flying yet, and he still needed an afternoon sleep. Netta and Elfrin joined the other fairy folk for a picnic lunch under the trees. Later, in the middle of the afternoon, she found a hollow under a shady fern, made a nice nest of soft moss, and tucked her baby brother up in it. "Now go to sleep, little one," she told him, "and I'll come back to fetch you at tea time." Elfrin shut his eyes obediently, but as soon as she had gone, he opened them. He climbed out of his bed and toddled off. And he had not gone very far when he heard some tweeting in a large bush. He looked up and saw a fluffy baby bluebird on the edge of a nest wanting to take its first flight. As he looked, the bird fell from the nest and, flapping wildly, landed on the soft moss in front of Elfrin. "You naughty birdie," scolded Elfrin. "You should be sleeping in bed." He picked up the baby bird, which was nearly as big as he was, and puffing and panting lugged it back to his own nest under the fern and tucked it in. "Now go to sleep, little one," he said firmly, just as Netta had said to him, and he toddled off to explore further. Meanwhile, the mother and father bluebirds fluttered back to their nest to feed the earthworms to their baby, and found their baby had gone. They flew into a panic, fluttering here and there, tweeting loudly and terrified that any harm had come to their baby. When they couldn't find it anywhere, they flew through the trees until they came to one of the nearest of the fairies, which happened to be Netta. They twittered to her in a very worried way, and being a fairy, she could understand what they were trying to tell her. "Calm down," she told them. "Your baby can't be very far. I'll help you look for it." While this was going on, Elfrin had arrived back at the bush with a nest in it. He looked up, wondering if there were any more fluffy baby birds in it, and since he couldn't fly very well, he climbed all the way up the bush and out along a branch until he reached the nest and could look inside. The nest was empty, but it was such a cozy nest, just about elf-sized, in fact, that Elfrin thought he would try it out. He climbed in, feeling rather tired, and before he knew it, he had fallen asleep. In the other nest under the fern, the baby bluebird had recovered from the shock of falling out of its nest, and had sat up and began loudly tweeting for its mother and father. Very soon, Netta and the bluebirds heard it, and were led by its loud tweets to the fern-shaded mossy nest Netta had made for her brother earlier. "Well, here is your baby, but where is my baby brother?" cried Netta, now rather worried herself. While the bluebirds fussed around their little one, she tried working things out. "I wonder if," she murmured to herself, and she flew off to the big bush where the bluebirds had told her they had built their nest. Of course, there she found her little brother sleeping peacefully. "What have you been up to, Elfrin?" laughed Netta. Elfrin opened his big blue eyes and yawned. "Tea time?" he asked at his sister. "Yes, tea time," smiled his sister, "and the bluebirds want their nest back for their baby, so unless you want earthworms for tea like the baby bluebird, you had better come home with me." This one is about a dragon. The Dragon's Tale. Gulda, the dragon, lived in a large cave deep in the fairyland forest. A narrow stony track led past the cave, and Gulda liked to lumber down it and sun himself in his favourite spot beside a big boulder, where some scrubby bushes hid him from passing fairy folk. Now and then he would peer at them through the leaves and think it might be fun to jump out and give them all a fright. However, by the time he had made up his mind to jump, it was much too late because they were already around the bend in the track. Dragons are long-lived, not very clever creatures, but they are good at doing what dragons are supposed to do, guarding treasure. Gulda had been guarding a magnificent treasure for such a long time that he had forgotten to whom it belonged. He spent most of his time in his cave, curled around the treasure and sleeping soundly with his chin resting on the golden casket. Once a month, he came outside to feed upon certain mosses and lichens which grew upon rotten logs, and to rest in the sun. He was a contented, sleepy dragon, and the only time he was irritable and uncomfortable was when, like his relatives the lizard, he shed his skin. The shedding always happened on the first day of spring. First, he felt as if his skin was too tight. Then, before he knew it, his old skin was lying around him on the sandy floor like cast-off clothes, and there he was, pale gold, damply shining, feeling rather chilly and knowing that the usual awful itchiness was about to start. Gulda had shed his skin each spring for 50 years before it suddenly came to him that it would be nice to have someone to scratch him with a stick in the places where he itched and couldn't scratch himself. From that time on, every spring when he shed his skin, he would hide in the bushes near his favourite boulder and try to seize a passing pixie to scratch his itches. For 50 years he failed because the pixies were too quick for him. They were so cheeky that if he was snoozing in the sun and his tail fell across the track, they would jump backwards and forwards across it, or dare each other to tweak it, but he just could not catch one of them. So for many, many years he had to go on bearing the awful itchiness from sunrise to sunset, by which time his new skin had hardened and he was comfortable again. However, one spring morning, as he stood damp, shiny, and shivering, surrounded by remnants of his old skin, a brilliant idea suddenly struck him. With a deep chuckle, he picked up his old tail, stuffed it with sand, and carefully hiding it under his wing, he lumbered out of his cave and along the track to his favourite spot. Once there, he laid the false tail around the one side of the boulder and lay in wait around the other, crouching down among the bushes. Presently, some pixies crept up to False Tail, daring each other to tweak it. Suddenly, Gulda burst from the bushes, grabbed the nearest pixie, and held him tight. "Gotcha!" he growled as the pixie squealed with fright. "At last, at long, long last, I've got someone to scratch my itches." When Pixie, whose name was Nimble, realized he was not going to be the dragon's dinner, but was only expected to scratch the dragon's back for a few hours, he stopped struggling, and having found a good scratching stick, followed Gulda down into his cave. When his eyes grew used to the gloom, Nimble gasped as he saw the huge, glittering heap of treasure in the middle of the floor. Gulda allowed the pixie to sort out his treasure in between scratching duties, and when Nimble discovered toys which had once belonged to the princes and princesses, they played games together on the cave floor. Gulda got very excited about knocking down ebony skittles with golden bowling balls, and playing draughts with diamonds and emeralds on a board inlaid with mother of pearl. Hours later, worn out by so much excitement and with his new skin comfortable at last, the dragon curled up round his treasure and fell asleep. Nimble crept quietly out of the cave, Silly old dragon, he said to himself. It's taken him 100 years to think up false tail thing. He's probably dim enough to think he can catch a pixie next spring with the same trick. A twinkle came into his eye as he remembered how much Golda had enjoyed having his itches scratched, and how excited he had become whenever he managed to knock over some skittles. Suddenly, the pixie chuckled. If he does try this false tail trick again next year, I think maybe, just maybe, I might let him catch me again. And then there's the beautiful sleeping dragon. I would very much like to draw more dragons. I find them rather difficult. And that's it, the end. We did it. We made it all the way through this bedtime stories, fairy tales for young children, which took a rather long time. I hope that you enjoyed these stories. If you can remember any, which were your favourite stories of the bedtime stories by Shirley Barber? I really liked the one about the dragon at the end, and not just because it's the only one I can remember because it's the last one we just read, but because the dragon was a little bit dopey and a vegetarian and just really wanted a pat. Alright, I hope that you enjoyed this limited series of Shirley Barber book readings. If I come across any more Shirley Barber books in my path, I will buy them and read them to you. But yeah, that's gonna be it for now. I hope you enjoyed. Yeah, alright. Good night, good night, good night. Good night, good night, good night, good night. Good night, sleep well, good night, sleep well, good night, sleep.